South Africa could start taking away white-owned land without compensation and giving that land back to black farmers. For some, this is history being righted, a just retribution for the years of exploitation and dispossession by white settlers. For others, it's a path to economic ruin and an issue that has inflamed right-wing commentators abroad who talk of white genocide. So what is South Africa doing about its land? More than 20 years since the end of apartheid, inequality is still rife in South Africa. A recent World Bank report said that the country is one of the most unequal in the world. While workers at the bottom have wages similar to the average in Bangladesh, those in the top 10% enjoy wages closer to Austria. And race is a strong indicator of poverty. The country's poorest are almost exclusively black and coloured South Africans. Some politicians believe that this inequality is largely caused by a lack of black land ownership, since many black South Africans are consigned to townships. And townships are underdeveloped urban areas that were reserved for Africans, coloureds and Indians during apartheid. So what does land ownership have to do with modern South Africa? Before the end of apartheid in 1994, the country faced centuries of colonisation. It began in the 17th century with the arrival of the Dutch, and over the years, European settlers dispossessed the indigenous population of their land. In 1913, the theft was formalised and the Natives Land Act was signed, which saw the majority of South African land reserved for whites or Europeans. Then in the 1960s, a series of laws were passed called the Group Areas Act, and these laws prevented free movement and forced black people to live in townships and work only in certain areas. Today, in South Africa, white people still own 73% of private farmland in the country, despite only making up 8% of South Africa's population. This is what South Africa's president thinks about land ownership in his country.
The dispossession of land of the indigenous people of this country is therefore what I characterize as the original sin that continues to constrain the realization of the potential of our people.
South Africa's parliament has agreed to re-examine a constitutional clause on land reform, and that includes the possibility of allowing expropriation without compensation. The African National Congress said it would transfer 30% of white-owned land to black farmers by 2000, but that target was never met. Ruth Hall, a professor who focuses on the land question, says that the ANC government has failed to use its mandate to redress land dispossession over the last 24 years.
The land reform process has proceeded very slowly. What that means in practice is that the interests of property owners have routinely trumped the interests of black South Africans.
So what do both sides say? The issue of land reform has been campaigned for by the economic freedom fighters. They're a far-left party and the third largest in the South African parliament. Their leader is Julius Malema, a controversial figure who has been convicted of hate speech in the past. They argue that a revolutionary form of land reform will allow greater economic equality, as well as give black Africans their dignity.
Access to the land is an important basis to participate in a common project of nationhood. And to that extent, it's not just about poverty and inequality and economy. It is also a question of belonging. It's a question fundamentally for us of dignity.
But the idea of taking the land without compensation has been heavily criticised. Some, such as the Democratic Alliance, the main opposition party, says that this is the ANC government's attempt to court EFF voters. I spoke with Ken Robertson. He's the Democratic Alliance's shadow minister for land reform. The Democratic Alliance says land expropriation without compensation will damage the South African economy. And Robertson said that the Constitution does not even need to change to implement land reform. He said that the government has just been slow to act.
So we're totally behind land reform, as long as it's within the parameters of the Constitution. And again, there's no reason to be able to be venturing out of the Constitution where it has been proven in the Western Cape that land reform can actually work.
Now, many opponents point to Zimbabwe, where former President Robert Mugabe led a program that seized the lands of thousands of white farmers. Farms were given to his political allies or people without the training to farm productively, and that led to a collapse in the country's economy. But South Africa's president says any land invasions will not be tolerated, and that lessons will be learned from Zimbabwe. So what do other countries think? President Ramaphosa's reassurances have not stopped this issue being used by right-wing pundits across the world.
The ANC, the African National Congress, which has been in power ever since '94, and they've basically destroyed the country, and now they're attempting to turn it into Zimbabwe by crushing the minority.
Cannot allow that nation to go into a type of Rwanda genocide. We've got to help these people. We've got to help our Judeo-Christian friends.
Right-wing commentators abroad believe that white farmers are being murdered at alarming rates, and that this new attempt to change the constitution will simply worsen the situation. That's a claim pushed by groups such as AfriForum, an Afrikaner civil rights group. But the notion that white farmers are any more at risk in South Africa is wrong. You are far more likely to be murdered if you're a poor black person. Lizette Lancaster from the Institute for Security Studies broke it down for me, explaining the murder figures in South Africa between April 2016 and March 2017.
Around 74 murders took place on farms and small holdings in South Africa. But that in context with over 19,000 murders during the same period, notably that most people being murdered in South Africa are definitely not white.
Another argument put forward by white farmers is that black Africans want urban land, not farmland, and that when black Africans have been given agricultural land, they've managed it poorly. In fact, there are more than 250,000 black farmers who want the land, and the demand is high. Professor Hall says the problem with land reform so far has been its implementation.
I think our big mistake over the past 20 years has been keeping big commercial estates intact and then asking groups of poor black people to run those estates on the same basis. I think that what we need to be doing is actually changing our landholding structure.
Essentially, South Africa is still divided into the geography of apartheid. There are large commercial estates for white farmers and then tiny small holdings that were former native reserves, territory set aside for black Africans during apartheid. Professor Hall hopes the current debate will ultimately lead to changes in the way South Africa is divided and who gets the land.
Is this for black middle class? Is this for small-scale farmers? Is it for farm workers? Who should be getting land? And what kinds of production models are we looking at?
So what are the chances of land reform in South Africa? The issue of land reform is now being reviewed by a government committee, and it remains to be seen whether the constitution will be changed to allow for expropriation without compensation. But what is clear is that land redistribution has been incredibly slow in the first 24 years of South African democracy. So is this latest attempt at change a ploy by the ANC government to win voters? Or is it a genuine attempt to address an historical injustice? Whatever is decided, South Africa still remains one of the world's most unequal countries, and the remnants of apartheid are still far from being addressed.